at your center, and I love the interdisciplinary nature of your center and all its associates, and you have so many doctoral students and faculty involved, so congratulations. So today, this is an outline of the presentation. I'll begin with some background and inspiration. I'd like to highlight the methodology that we use to formulate many of our problems. And then I'd like to discuss a series of different models that we have developed that take advantage of quite advanced methodological frameworks, but they also have a lot of implication for policy. So I think you'll appreciate some of the case studies that we've done. One has focused on Hurricane Katrina, and another one on tornadoes that hit Western Massachusetts. This is something that isn't supposed to happen, but as we know with climate change, there are all sorts of unusual events and more intense events. In addition, I will speak about some related work that we have done on game theory and disaster relief. And I'll be bringing some ideas from the pandemic as well, because I really believe that game theory can help us in terms of many different applications now to the COVID-19 pandemic. And that even includes this intense competition for PPEs that we're all hearing about, and it's the reality. I will try and conclude my presentation speaking about work that we've done on blood supply chains and focusing also on game theory there. I might talk about some analytics work that we've done that has actually impacted policy, and then I will be concluding. So let's begin. So background and inspiration, where do your ideas come from for research? I work on the modeling of network systems. I am obsessed with networks. I have been for many years. I began working on congested urban transportation networks, and they often say, if you can handle the modeling of congested urban transportation networks with the behavior of different decision makers interacting, different modes of transportation, and the large-scale nature of transportation networks, many of the other problems tend to be fairly easy. Well, I don't know if I would say that exactly, but I do believe that many network system problems do operate under decentralized decision-making behavior, and that includes the internet. And we've actually done a lot of work on trying to re-envision the network of the internet using different concepts from game theory, all sorts of simulations, and that was a very wonderful future Internet of Architecture project. We were one of 5 teams in the nation selected by the National Science Foundation. I've done also a lot of work, I would say for the past 15 years or so, on supply chains. And one of the things I find so fascinating about supply chains, and also students appreciate that very much as well, is the wealth and breadth of applications. And different supply chain problems will have different peculiarities. You can keep on advancing the models, adapting the models. For example, we've done a lot of work even in the pandemic on fresh produce supply chains, many different types of healthcare supply chains, including pharmaceutical supply chains. And also we've been writing about the cold chain and the deep freeze chain for potential vaccines against COVID-19. So most of the books that I've written have some sort of network in the title, not all, but most. And we're now actually in the process of finishing up the editing of the 3rd volume of the Dynamics of Disasters book. And this is a conference that we organize in Greece every other year. And we're hoping to be able to do it actually next summer in Athens, Greece, which will also be the venue for the big Euro conference. So networks, okay. We know that networks have been essential to transportation and logistics in numerous sectors, including defense. I'll actually be even mentioning the Euler method, so I thought it was appropriate to actually give credit to wonderful Euler in 1736, earliest paper on graph theory, and of course the Königsberg bridges problem, which is very famous. And interestingly enough, even Napoleon took advantage of transportation models, which I think is super cool. When I teach my humanitarian logistics and healthcare class, and that's one of my favorite classes to teach, I teach it in the spring. I bring in a lot of practitioners, a lot of speakers, and one of my favorite sayings is that armchair generals talk strategy, but real generals talk logistics, and in operations research, we're obviously really big in logistics. It's one of the major applications of a great field. So just to show you some of the practitioners that I brought in, and sometimes they come from, very, very far away, and sometimes they're more local. This is an amazing woman, Debbie Wilson, who worked for Doctors Without Borders, battling Ebola in Liberia right at the onset. She was there in 2014, came back in 2016, one of the bravest women I've ever met. And she's now actually working on her doctorate at Johns Hopkins. I have had Mr. Carnival, who was the director of MEMA, that's the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency, head of the Central and Western Massachusetts branch, speaking to my students about how he was in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria hit, lived on a cruise ship, and believe me, not the most wonderful accommodations, and all the challenges that they were faced with there, including the disruption to electric power. And of course, I would be remiss not to have someone from the National Guard speaking actually how the National Guard helped in their response to Superstorm Sandy. And a very special guest speaker that I had was Dr. Hariri. He's a surgeon originally from Syria. He was at Harvard under their Scholars at Risk program, so I brought him to speak to my students. And many of the speakers are not only heartwarming, some of the students, and sometimes the speakers even end up in tears because it's very, very emotional, but this is something that's quite transformative to have speakers like this. And Dr. Hariri actually continued educating medical students in Syria using a cell phone while he was based in Cambridge, which is incredible. And his stories are amazing. You can visit my blog where I document some of these amazing talks and individuals. So something which I also emphasize, and is kind of one of the themes in this presentation, is that network models are also very, very useful in disaster relief, as well as in healthcare supply chains. When we talk about, for example, producing vaccines, producing pharmaceuticals, you will have many stages of the production process, and also the supply chain. And when you have a cold chain, you have to worry about that as well. Proper refrigeration. And we are also very cautious when it comes to the emissions generated, the impacts on the environment of the waste associated with production of various pharmaceuticals. So when we look at some of the disasters, the number of disasters is increasing as well as the number of people affected. Now we're having cascading disasters, for example, on the West Coast, and this is something where we need to bring to bear, the best talents of our students, our researchers and practitioners to try and mitigate and also to try and respond and recover from such disasters. So can you imagine in 2012, Superstorm Sandy, Manhattan skyline was almost, totally black. Okay? And very often, I write a lot of books. I love writing books. As soon as I finish one book, usually another publisher says, Anna, when are you going to write another book for us? Yeah, okay. Never a dull moment. But 9/11, I had my Super Networks book at the JFK airport. It was supposed to be sent to my publisher. That obviously got delayed, and my co-author Networks Against Time book was actually at the Spring Street office of my publisher Springer, which had flooded during Superstorm Sandy. And I can go on, but It's kind of interesting. So in 2017, and I'm thinking 2020 might even beat this, but this is, I thought, a really nice graphic that was developed by, where you see the billion-dollar weather and climate disasters in the U.S. from the triple hurricanes that hit, right, our south and southeast, from the various fires, and we're having similar wildfires, even on a worse scale, happening on the West Coast, from Washington State all the way down through California. So you can see this. So what are some of the challenges associated with disaster relief? When we work in humanitarian logistics and operations, you have to conceive of appropriate objective functions. You have to consider, sometimes equity, different kinds of criteria. So it's quite challenging, but intellectually, I think, very, very rewarding, and you can make an impact. So that is gratifying. Obviously, timely deliveries are extremely important, but the infrastructure might be damaged. I've mentioned already, electric power networks could be down. Obviously, the transportation networks could be disrupted, bridges destroyed, trees on roads. Healthcare facilities might be compromised as well, as happened during Superstorm Sandy. For example, in New York City, many of the hospitals, they had their generators in the basement, not a good idea. They flooded, and then they were without electric power. And very, very challenging. Also, what happens sometimes in terms of disaster relief, you have shipments of the wrong supplies, they create congestion that involves additional handling and a waste of time by the human resources. And that's really a serious, serious problem. So the models that I'll be talking about will show you how to handle, for example, material convergence when you have for example, too much of the supplies arriving, for example. And also at the same time, we'll show you how we handle the fact that it's important to have a minimum amount of certain demands at different points of demand, because you might have greater populations at certain locations, lower population at others. And also what I think is so interesting about our work, will demonstrate that if you don't have certain constraints, you could get very, very bad answers in terms of disaster response. Okay? So also you may have heard after some disasters, you get the wrong supplies being delivered. For example, after Hurricane Katrina, there were tuxedos delivered. Who needs tuxedos at that point? After Fukushima disaster, there were too many blankets. It was actually warm. Wrong items of clothing sometimes get delivered. Different kinds of food, which people might not be consuming because of their religion, and so forth. So clearly, better coordination is needed among the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations. Okay, so this is something that's really important to emphasize, and that helps also in motivating our work. Our models tend to integrate the financial side with the logistical side. Many researchers will focus primarily on the logistical aspects of disaster relief. One has to realize that humanitarian organizations, many NGOs, they're actually nonprofits, so they actually depend on donations, and also they depend on the very sustainability on our financial donations. Sometimes governments help too, obviously, but that's usually not enough. So very often people will donate to different NGOs based on how they perceive their response to a particular disaster is. And this is the latest data that I could find. There are about 1.5 million registered NGOs in the United States, which is, a humongous number. To whom should you be donating? And there are even rankings of different NGOs. And the U.S. Citizens tend to be very generous. In 2017, they donated Look at this, over $400 billion paid to U.S. nonprofits and charities. But the thing is, these NGOs, they compete for the financial funds. So how do we model, the competition for financial funds? That's something challenging. And how do we incorporate that into their objective functions? So I'll be discussing that today with you. Okay. And we definitely need appropriate analytical tools that can assist NGOs and governments in modeling the complex interactions. There could be numerous NGOs, as I was seeing, responding to a big event like post the Haiti earthquake. There could be thousands, and that's very, very complicated. So think of, who's coordinating, think about the congestion. How do we make things work more effectively because there are people suffering? And so I work with the variational equality problem, which is a very elegant formalism that allows us to capture the behavior of different decision makers, the constraints, and also the decision variables. So it's essentially a single inequality, and I work on finite dimensional variational equalities primarily, but also done work on infinite dimensional variational equalities with collaborators in Italy, for example, and Canada. So here we're interested in determining a vector X star. It could be path flows, for example. It could be commodity shipments from different origin nodes to destinations. Sometimes we even have prices as variables. And this is a single inequality. This is the feasible set K. These will be the constraints. And this is an inner product that has to hold for all possible feasible X's. Okay? So typically this vector f of X star is the one that captures the behavior of decision makers. So for example, transportation networks, that could be the user path costs associated with travel between different origin and destination pairs. In terms of, say, profit maximization and Nash equilibrium game theory problems, it would be, say, for example, mine is the grading of the utility functions with respect to the strategic variables and so forth. Okay, so here we have this. And moreover, it's important to emphasize that the variational equality problem contains, as special cases, many of the classical mathematical programming problems, systems of equations, optimization problems, complementarity problems, and also many game theory problems operating under Nash equilibrium. So it's kind of, I believe, a natural methodological framework for a spectrum of supply chain network problems operating either under centralized or decentralized behavior. Okay. And in addition, I like to emphasize we're not just interested in an optimal solution, say, or say an equilibrium solution governed by some equilibrium conditions. Very often we're interested in the dynamics or temps-de-mort processes that precede, okay, the equilibrium. And also, how do we know that we'll have stability results? Will we have global stability and equilibrium solution? So in 1993, we introduced a new kind of dynamical system, which is non-classical, with Paul Dupuis, and my book with Ding Zhang was published in 1996, discussing these kinds of dynamical systems. So you would think about what makes it actually special is that we guarantee that the trajectories always behave in a manner such that the constraints are satisfied and the variables lie within the feasible set, which makes sense. You don't want negative product flows. That doesn't make sense. Negative prices don't make sense. So I think it's a very powerful methodology. And also, as we know, in operations research, applied mathematics, different fields of computer science, and also engineering, if you develop a powerful methodology, it can be applied to different settings. And now the projected dynamical systems have been applied in economics to evolutionary games. We've done a lot of work in ecological predator-prey networks. It's been used in neuroscience. Some of my computer science colleagues are even using it in neural networks. And I mentioned already the future internet architecture work that we've done. So there are numerous optimization models in disaster relief, and this literature keeps on growing. It's attracting a lot of, I think, top researchers and many, many students, and these are just some of the names. Okay. And also it's global, this audience, because just about every region in the world is being affected by disasters. So people are responding accordingly. And there are also quite a few excellent surveys, so I've highlighted some at the bottom of this slide. Okay, I mentioned time in disaster relief. So in terms of optimization models, we developed a model which focuses actually on two stages of disaster relief, the preparedness and response. And this was published in a book dedicated to the founder of regional science, Walter Iser. It was quite thrilling to have an invited chapter in the book on this topic, and also the Nobel laureate Paul Krugman, who has the Nobel Prize in Economics, also contributed a chapter. Okay, so what about game theory for post-disaster humanitarian relief? I've mentioned two of the books that we've edited on dynamics of disasters, and there are quite a few relevant chapters there. I even use some of the chapters from practitioners in the course that I teach, Humanitarian Logistics and Healthcare, because I think they're very illuminating and very informative. So the first game theory model that we developed for disaster relief was actually a generalized Nash Equilibrium model. And it was constructed with a colleague of mine in economics, Saren Soilu, and also one of my former students, who's originally from Mexico, Emilio Alvarez Flores. Now, as I mentioned before, our models very often incorporate a financial component and a logistical or supply chain component. And this is, the absolute first. So let me show you. And moreover, what's really nice, a special case becomes a Nash equilibrium. So here we have competition for financial donations, and donors typically respond to the media exposure and coverage of a disaster. Otherwise, how do you know that there's a disaster happening? How do you know of the severity of the disaster and actually the needs? So there are several authors, scholars who contributed, emphasizing the importance of media to disaster relief and also to the response of donors to donating money. And these are some of the contributions. And fairly recently, authors Zhuang, Saxton, and Wu were emphasizing that we really need to have more game theory models. And you can think of game theory, you have non-cooperation, you might have cooperation. They're just different kinds of concepts, so very worthwhile to explore. And also game theory emphasizes that there are multiple decision makers, and that's important because that's obviously the case when it comes to disaster relief. And I'm very proud that two of my former PhD students, Fuminori Tresaki and Tina Wackelbanger, published probably the first paper which handles financial donations and also earmark donations and game theory. And these are some survey articles on game theory and disaster relief. So something else I'd like to bring to your attention, now we're in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and here we have such competition. It's and lack of coordination in many spheres, and that includes the shortages of medical supplies, PPEs, and that's been going on for over 6 months, which is, in my opinion, absurd. Obviously, the coronavirus outbreak began in China, and China produced more than half of the world's PPEs, so their exports of PPEs declined. Also, there were many kind of trade barriers, trade policies implemented, even in the developed world, like Germany, for example. They weren't supposed to export PPEs. So there were clear shortages for various reasons. Okay. And this is very, very troubling. Even in April, a staffer wrote, providers using one mask for 3+ weeks, many COVID patients, 0 gowns. And the competition has been intense. There have been obviously healthcare organizations competing for PPEs. There have been cities competing for PPEs. There have been states competing, governors for PPEs. And look at this. I mean, this is fairly recent. A couple of weeks ago, the president of the American Medical Association wrote on August 26th, it's hard to believe our nation finds itself dealing with the same shortfall witnessed during the first few weeks, of the pandemic. That situation exists today, and in many ways, things have gotten worse. Okay, so, we've been doing the modeling of this, and generalized Nash equilibrium models are very relevant in addressing also the shortages of PPEs when you have fixed supply. So it's something, because you have many competing. So on August 4th, I published an article in the conversation because we had written several papers on this topic, the raging competition for medical supplies. It's not a game, but game theory can help. Okay, so here we have one of our recent papers on the topic, and it's now in press in an edited volume. And there we also have stochastic demand. So let me begin with the first model that we constructed with Saren Soilu and Emilio Alvarez Flores on generalized Nash equilibrium and game theory for disaster relief. So we're going to consider multiple NGOs that are going to be competing for financial funds, and there are different locations where they need to deliver their relief items. So you have relief items flowing from the NGOs to points of demand, and at the same time, we're going to have financial funds flowing from donors to the particular NGOs. So what are the constraints? Say that each of the NGOs has pre-positioned some supplies, which is kind of standard. We've also extended this model to allow for purchasing in terms of two-stage game theory problems, which was recently published in the new journal SN Ortho. So you have a fixed amount of supply, and they're interested in figuring out the logistical relief item shipments to the various demand points. They have to be non-negative, and they incur different costs associated with transportation. And listen, NGOs are nonprofits, right? So they also derive some utility from doing good. So there's some sort of altruism factor. So even economists are working on this. And so here we have each NGO associating a positive weight, omega I, with, say, how much they will actually deliver to different points of demand. And there's also a certain positive factor associated with each of the deliveries. And we've used similar kinds of components to utility functions in our work in hospital competition in terms of prices and quality of care. So here, this is where some of the competition comes in for the financial donations. Each NGOI, based on media attention and the visibility of the NGOs at the various locations where they're giving out these items, acquires funds from donors given by the following expression. Beta I is going to be a parameter that reflects the proportion of total donations collected for the disaster at demand point J. That is received by NGOI, and PJ is then the financial donations that are garnered because of the visibility at location J. And it depends upon all the logistical flows, not of just a particular one, NGO, but of all of them. So you see, that's quite a general function. So what is the utility function? Each NGOI seeks to maximize its utility, which includes, how much in terms of the financial donations they're going to obtain, an altruism component of the utility function, minus the total logistical costs associated with shipping, the relief item supply, subject to the availability constraints, the supply constraints, and the non-negativity constraints. So here, these are the additional constraints that we're imposing. Say you're like a supra, a governmental organization, or maybe a branch of the United Nations, and we're interested in having a lower bound of relief items at demand point J for all of them, and also an upper bound, because we want to reduce the material convergence, right? We don't want to have too much, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we have a sufficient amount of relief items. Because many of the relief items, if you don't get water and food within, say 48, 72 hours, people are going to be perishing. The same goes for certain medical supplies. Okay. Also, we assume that we have a sufficient amount among all the NGOs associated with the relief items, and they're not lower than the total amount of the demand at the different demand points post the disaster. So here, we're interested in, okay, all of these are going to be competing with one another. But notice here we have not only the utility functions of the NGOs will depend upon the strategies of the different NGOs, but also the constraints do as well, because you have common lower bounds on the demands at the various demand points and also common upper bounds. So that's what makes this problem a generalized Nash equilibrium as opposed to just a Nash equilibrium problem. And typically, the algorithms for generalized Nash equilibrium problems aren't as advanced. So this was kind of challenging. But what we were able to find is that for a problem with our structure, amazingly, there actually was an optimization reformulation because it satisfied the criteria. This is results obtained by two authors in their paper, Lee and Lin. So we were actually able to reformulate the problem as an optimization problem. But still you have the lower bounds and upper bounds. So we used a variational inequality methodology because we wanted to ultimately maybe even put extensions, which we did, into this framework. Okay, so this becomes the variational inequality, a single inequality that captures the behavior. And we also have Lagrange multipliers associated with the supply constraints and with the lower and upper bound demand constraints at the various demand points. Okay, so you can see how those are handled. And what's really nice is that the underlying feasible set is just the non-negative ortho. So that makes the algorithmic scheme quite easy to implement and actually quite efficient. Yeah? So it contains, so the algorithm, we actually, in the paper by Dupuy, we were able to construct a general iterative scheme for this tracking of the projected dynamical system trajectories until a steady state is achieved, and the steady state will coincide with the set of solutions to the corresponding variation quality problem. So here we have explicit formula for the commodity shipments at an iteration, tau plus 1, which is really nice, and also explicit formulae for the various Lagrange multipliers. They have to be non-negative, so you can see how that works because it is very easy to implement iteration by iteration. Students love implementing this algorithm in MATLAB. And so let's see the case study. We decided to use data, okay, because it's more readily available, post-Hurricane Katrina. And also it's important to realize that when Hurricane Katrina, and recently we marked the 15th anniversary of this disaster that has been called an American tragedy, okay, because in August 2005 it happened. It left, almost 500,000 people homeless, took many, many lives, and it primarily affected, based on the insurance claims, the states of Louisiana and Mississippi. Okay, that's something important. All right. So we were able to get some data on the post-hurricane damage assessment, and the damage was over 100 billion. Some estimates that is, as high as 150 billion. And actually, the restoration process took a very, very long time. There have been some, kind of mitigation measures instituted, but this has been also a very challenging hurricane season. As you know, we're even running out of names. We're down to the Greek letters, naming like Hurricane Beta. So we'll see what happens once this unusual 2020 year is over with. So here we considered 3 NGOs, the Red Cross, which is very responsive, and the Salvation Army. They were quite present. And then another NGO, which we classified as being others. And in Louisiana, they kind of organized themselves into what are known as parishes. Okay, so we had 3 NGOs and 10 demand points, and essentially a super sink. We constructed those financial donation functions. They were concave. And we also assigned equal weights associated with the altruism components of the utility functions for the 3 different NGOs. Now, here, based on the damage estimates and so on, in terms of the homes, we had lower bounds, and these are in millions of relief item units, and also upper bounds for the various parishes. And we also estimated the various logistical costs. You could parameterize the various functions that we needed for the utility functions. And let me show you the generalized Nash equilibrium product flows when you solve the problem, and then I'll compare it to the Nash equilibrium solution. So let's suppose we don't have those lower and upper bounds on the demands at the various demand points. And that's essentially, if you don't have someone managing the flows, what will happen? And I will contrast the answers, and you'll see it's quite dramatic. So these were, and it's important to realize that, you'll have the demands met, at least the lower bounds. You won't go over the upper bounds in the solution. Okay? And we have the total utility that was obtained, and also the financial components, which is used when it was very close to was actually achieved in terms of millions of dollars in donations. Okay? And also it's important that, this model, when you have these constraints met, these common constraints, it also guarantees that the costs are minimal, which is very important because the NGOs have to respond to this and report to their stakeholders. They can't be misusing the money. Okay, so if we remove those common shared constraints, okay, we obtain what is a Nash equilibrium. And that's what many, work on Nash equilibrium. Even that in itself, I think, is contributions. It's kind of interesting. If you don't have the common constraints, they're competing. Okay, what are going to be the solutions? You get entirely different product flows entirely. And this is what happens. Okay, obviously, if we remove these constraints, the common constraints, each NGO is going to have a higher utility. Okay, but what happens, you get totally different product flows, and moreover, the victims suffer. Okay, this is something which is, really, really painful. And you think about this intuition. Of course, if you don't have those common constraints, NGOs to kind of maximize the visibility and to minimize their logistical costs, they'll be shipping supplies to where it's easier to get them to. Okay, but that means there's probably not the demand there because that area hasn't been as damaged. And that's exactly what our solution shows. Okay, so the St. Charles Parish, okay, receives roughly almost 800% of its upper demand, okay, while the Orleans Parish only receives about, 1/3 of its minimum requirements, because where it's easy to get to is where the supplies are being shipped. And that's just, so you have a huge amount of waste, you have victims suffering, and this also emphasizes why, the Nash equilibrium solution isn't sufficient, that model. You really need a generalized Nash equilibrium solution. So that will guarantee the minimum requirements are met. and there is no waste, okay, but you need a coordinating authority to do that. And also what we found, which I thought was really cool, that you can get higher financial donations under the Generalized Nash Equilibrium. So it's kind of a win-win situation, right? So then we decided, okay, what if we can have more general financial donation functions and also more general cost functions, because there's competition for freight service provision. So along with Patricia, Danielle, and Emilio, we presented an extension of our work at our Dynamics of Disasters conference, where you had more general transportation costs, more general financial donation cost functions, as well as the altruism or benefit functions. And the network becomes different. Okay? Now you don't have a common pool of financial funds going back, but now you have individual funds, okay, going back to the various NGOs. And this becomes the utility function. So you see there's competition for financial services, for financial donations, maybe even through the altruism functions as well. So here we couldn't reformulate this as an associated optimization problem, but we use a concept known as a variational equilibrium, which is a specific kind of generalized Nash equilibrium. And we can then formulate our problem as a variational equality problem. We don't have to appeal to the theory of quasi-variational equality. So this becomes, as I mentioned before, the gradient with respect to the strategic variables, which are the product flows, and you have the utility function. So again, it's a single inequality, and you have the common constraints, but you will have a common Lagrange multiplier associated, okay, with the various common constraints. And it has a nice kind of ethical, kind of efficiency, equity interpretation also economically. So I think that's really neat. And again, we have a single variational equality problem. We use Lagrange multipliers as variables in the formulation, which I think is really good. So what about the tornadoes hitting Western Massachusetts? I remember that day. So clearly the sky turned orange in Amherst, it turned green. And it was really strange. I was working my computer, but unusually I turned on the TV and it said tornadoes hitting, Western Massachusetts. It caused a swath of like 30 miles. It was horrific. And the Red Cross provided services at our Mass Mutual Center for over a month for the refugees actually from this tornado. Okay, tons of damage, millions of dollars. It was very, very bad. Okay, very, very shocking because we didn't expect something like this happening. So we used actually the more general model to study this, and we find again the similar kind of situation that the generalized Nash equilibrium solution is much better, but still the NGOs can gain financially, which is wonderful. Okay. So we do this research, right? We publish our papers, we write books, edit books, but how do you get it out to practice? Okay, I'm a big proponent of writing op-eds. I've been doing that for quite a few years. I publish articles, for example, in The Conversation, other venues, and they get reprinted and usually captured around the world. Okay, so that I urge you to do. It's not easy to do. It's a different mindset. Sometimes the readers really come back to you, but if we don't take the risks and go out there, we can't accomplish as much as I think we deserve to accomplish. So we've done a lot of other work on game theory and disaster relief, including the competition for freight service provision. That's a big issue. And here you have multi-tiered networks, and we're interested in both the prices as well as the product flows, and we capture decision-making behavior of multiple organizations associated with the different tiers. And this is really interesting because the humanitarian organizations are nonprofits, whereas freight service providers are for-profit. So you have totally different objective functions. And in a fairly recent paper published in the International Journal of Production Economics, we also introduce budget constraints, capacity constraints, and actually very proud of this paper. And in addition, we published a paper with Tina Wackelfinger in Austria and her PhD student, Timo Gussler, and collaborator Patricia Danielle in the European Journal of Operational Research, where we begin our work really as kind of a multi-stage framework. And then we've done more on this dimension and talking about different framework agreements and how NGOs can actually benefit through those. What about game theory and blood supply chains? We've done work using data from the American Red Cross. There's a huge upheaval in blood services in our country. They're faced in the COVID-19 pandemic with major shortages, and it's not only in the US, it's happening worldwide, China, Iran, and Europe. Many people still need blood, even in the pandemic, even though we had elective surgeries cut back for several months. And now there's maybe even hope. There are major trials happening between UMass Medical Center and also Johns Hopkins to investigate the potential of convalescent plasma, which we're also doing work on. And also in this industry, there have been a lot of mergers and acquisitions. Now, remember, when it comes to blood supply chains, it's a very unique product. It cannot be produced. It has to be donated by us. This is a perishable product. Okay, shelf life of platelets is only 5 days. Red blood cells is only 42 days. And typically, even though about 1/3 of the population in the US can donate, only about 10% regularly does. And because many schools and businesses were closed during the pandemic for multiple months, the collection was really, really challenged. So this is a very interesting supply chain. You have perishability, you have to do testing, and the Red Cross was closing testing facilities. They were closing down collection facilities. We were really interested in investigating this. So we have really the first blood supply chain optimization model with many, many features, and also uncertainty associated with the demand. So we have penalties associated with shortages and surpluses, and also a paper on mergers and acquisitions. That's a big issue now. Complete economic restructuring of blood services industry. Okay, so you can see we investigate potential synergies associated with mergers, which is happening even among between blood service organizations that are quite geographically dispersed, which is, I think, very, very interesting. And with a former doctoral student, now professor at Pace University, Pritha Dutta, we published the first actually game theory papers actually associated with competition for blood. Because it's not just the Red Cross that's collecting blood now. In fact, they only provide about 40% of the blood in the US right now. Okay, so competition for blood donations and even multi-tiered kinds of models that we've constructed. It's quite cool. So speaking about writing op-eds, on March 11, 2020, the World Health Organization declared the COVID-19 pandemic, and the next day my article was published in The Conversation on the shortages in blood supply chains, and this went viral. It was also extended by invitation from Harris and Schramm in Informs Analytics shortly thereafter. And many media requests followed. And this is something that's time consuming. You have to be always on, but it's really important to get results out. And I was extremely gratified that on April 22nd, 2020, there was a memo signed by 22 attorney generals in the United States advocating for relaxation in terms of blood donation criteria. That was sent to Admiral Brett Giroir, who is the Assistant Secretary. He's in the news often these days, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And my article in The Conversation was the first article cited on the first page. Okay, and actually, it's worked. It's influenced policy, which I think is fantastic. And these are some of the signatures of these attorney general. Okay, so summary and conclusions. Here I've talked about, kind of the intellectual history of how we got involved in game theory modeling for disaster relief. And our focus is integrating financial flows and logistical flows. We also showed you, the results of, generalized Nash equilibrium solution versus a Nash equilibrium solution. And, I'm really advocating for those common constraints here. And it worked for Hurricane Katrina, the insights, and also for our tornado study in Western Massachusetts. So mentioned blood supply chains, and now we're doing a lot of work on game theory in the COVID pandemic. And this is a paper that I mentioned. We have others where we have multi-stage stochastic game theory, generalized Nash equilibrium models, and a lot of competition for medical supplies. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm looking forward to the questions and also to meeting with individual faculty members and students. All the best to everyone, and do take care.
Okay. Thank you. We have plenty of questions, and please everyone continue posting as we go. So I'm going to start reading through them, and then Professor Nagurney will address them. So our first question for today is, hi Professor Nagurney, in your experience, what are the advantages of game theory models for disaster relief comparing to former models?
We can capture the interactions and behavior of multiple decision makers. It's not just one decision maker, but multiple ones. And that's the reality, because typically there are many decision makers and also many stakeholders. So I think that's a huge advantage.
Mm-hmm. Somewhat related, how does generalized Nash equilibrium model handle the issues with PPE problems due to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Okay, that's an excellent question. You have a fixed supply, and there are these many states, healthcare organizations, hospitals, schools, nursing homes competing for the same supplies. Okay, so they're common constraints. So that's what makes it tricky, but also more relevant. So, and that's very important to capture. So we have both models for fixed supplies and also elastic supplies where the prices might vary.
Perfect. A question from Caroline, and feel free to post follow-up questions, guys, as well, in case your question was not fully addressed. A question from Caroline, how do you measure the visibility of an NGO?
How do you measure that's through a kind of the donation functions. Essentially, the greater the donations, that means there was greater media exposure. Mm-hmm. It's all interrelated.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Question.
And that depends on what's happening, not just at one demand point, but it happens at other demand points. And it also depends not upon just the relief items from one NGO, but also from the others. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of complex. It's just on a single variable.
Mm-hmm. Question from Sudendra. If there is no much media attention, how does the model work?
If there's not much media attention, then you would probably drop out I would think the financial donation functions would have to be modified accordingly. Okay, it would probably be much lower. It'd probably based on kind of historical data. Okay, people used to give, to the Red Cross because they have historically given to the Red Cross, and you expect them to also give. But it's the media will be there. I mean, it's rare that we don't have media coverage, but it is true that in some disasters like floods, even Kashmir, there wasn't much coverage, and therefore there weren't many donations. So you see, so it's really intimately related, the media coverage and then the donations. Right. And now we have, social media, the internet, and assuming that that's going to work, obviously, sometimes the infrastructure is so compromised that, that's not working. Mm-hmm. Good.
Next question from an anonymous attendee. For the optimization model, is it possible to model complementarities between items? As in, you may get no benefit from items without their pairs, i.e., you may not be able to use flashlights without batteries or similar.
I'm not seeing that question. Good evening from India. That's pretty cool. Good evening. Good afternoon from Massachusetts.
So this is question from an anonymous
complementarity theory. What is a Nash equilibrium? I think I defined it. That's you have strategies. Each decision maker has his own strategies, and you compete until no one can improve upon his strategies unilaterally. You typically have an associated utility function.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of our students are master students and so may not be familiar with all the technical materials. Others are PhD students and may be more comfortable.
But good, you're learning. We're all learning, always learning.
We have a question from Bistra. What is a reasonable coordinating authority to enforce demand bounds, but also to leave decentralized selection to strategy for each NGO? In the current...
We envision like a United Nations authority. Okay, someone centralized who has jurisdiction over the area. And in some areas you would have that, like Korea and China and so forth, or some sort of super governmental authority. But this says if you don't, you know, this is what happens, and it is what happens. So you need that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's saying in the current solution, the strategies are jointly computed. So there has to be full disclosure and deference to the authority. Mm-hmm. So, Dendra asks, how is variational inequality different from generalized Nash equilibrium? Sorry, variational equilibrium different from generalized Nash equilibrium.
Okay, variational equalities are a methodology. Generalized Nash equilibrium are a concept in game theory.
Yeah, it's harder to teach variational inequality.
A lot of new terms and so forth, but that's good. I mean, I can share the slides. I'll probably post them on the Super Network site, and there are references to many of our papers.
Yeah, and you raise
quite a few are available online. So.
Yeah, you raise interest in these technical domains as well. A lot of people are going to want to learn about game theory after today.
Good.
So Bistra is asking, in the Katrina example, we have 3 entities and 10 nodes in the network. What are the scalability limitations of these models? What happens if we had 100 nodes or if we had 20 players? Which scale parameter is more problematic for the solution method?
No problem. We solve huge transportation problems as variational equality problems. You know, hundreds of thousands in the past. We've solved financial network problems with 250,000 variables in less than a CPU second. We have very good algorithms. Mm-hmm. And if you want to, we can also even massively parallelize, but we don't need to do that. We used to do that. Mm-hmm. So computations really aren't an issue. Many of the problems we work on, like in trade problems, they're very, very large-scale network problems. But here we really believe in, you know, providing the data inputs and the data outputs, and not just doing things via black box. So, and for that to publish a paper, you know, you can't have 100 pages of data. You know, so do what we can.
Makes sense. So a question from Haoming. Does the notion price of anarchy apply to your disaster relief model? If so, what does it imply and how does it compare to that of other proposed models?
Oh, that's really interesting. I'm trying to think, one of our recent papers, we actually have a price of anarchy and disaster relief, but I can't tell you which one, so I'm a little embarrassed. I'll have to search, but you definitely can do it. And actually we've done it. Mm-hmm. But for a more basic model than the ones I'm presenting here. Mm-hmm. That's kind of cool. I think that's the first example of something like that in disaster relief.
Mm-hmm.
So very good. See? Who asked that question? Someone knows the price of anarchy. That's impressive.
Yeah, that's one of our PhD students at CAIS.
Okay, I was just teaching my students that last week. My undergrads, actually.
Good. We have a question from Babak. Does a solution, I guess, well, I'm going to read it as it is. Does the solution will always exist for the VI? Under what constraints in your problem?
That in here, under what constraints does the...
Yeah, so...
if I could see it, maybe I can read it, but there's so many questions and comments, oh my goodness.
Sure, so I think it's asking, I'm gonna paraphrase and I apologize if I'm not, if I'm changing the meaning. I think it's asking what are the conditions under which the variational inequality problem has a solution?
Okay. Boy, I can give a whole lecture on this. Okay. Obviously, if the feasible set is compact and you're guaranteed to have a solution, if the function that enters the variational inequality is coercive, you're guaranteed to have a solution if it's strongly monotone, and so forth and so on. If you can assume that the demands are bounded, but if you see that the basic model, if we don't do the Lagrange multipliers, that's always going to have a solution because you have lower and upper bounds in the demands, and therefore the product shipments lie in a compact set. Mm-hmm. And the function that enters the variation quality is continuous. So you get check, check, check. Good questions, though. My goodness.
Next question from Zili Zhu. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing the name right. Thanks, Professor Nagurney. In your table of Hurricane Katrina demand point parameters, what the KJ means? Does it mean distance?
See, that I didn't hear. Something about Katrina.
Sure. I'll try and speak loud. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Yeah, so it's asking in the Hurricane Katrina demand point parameters table, what does KJ mean? Is it the distance?
What were those? I didn't hear. The lower and upper bounds had to do with millions of relief items in the parishes, and that was based on population. And we even took into consideration if some of them had left or migrated. Mm-hmm. So those are pretty good estimates.
Okay. Next question from Jenny Sargent. And probably this is going to be one of our last ones. Hello, Professor Nagurney. It is so much fun to rejoin your lectures. Your work in frameworks is intriguing, especially following the slide of freight optimization from the standpoint of for-profit organizations. Something that has struck me about COVID, which has been true of other disaster responses, is the activation of various for-profit entities. For example, CVS is hosting COVID testing centers. In building partnership frameworks, is it possible to integrate for-profit and NGO stakeholders for optimization throughout all stages of disaster relief, i.e. integration from supply to distribution to demand points for greater cooperation and efficiency?
Hey, that's excellent. Boy, this is really good. I hope you're recording the questions too, because it's really, really useful. Actually, one of the models that I highlighted in my presentation, I talked about the NGOs and also the freight service providers. And the freight service providers are actually for-profits. So we have done some work on that. And I really think to battle this pandemic effectively, especially with the COVID-19 vaccines and the cold chain, we have to have, and it has to happen, that we have the public-private partnerships, and also the for-profit and the not-for-profit. And if you look at the for-profit, you can think about, for example, UPS already building the freezer farms for the deep, the deep cold chain, Pfizer's vaccine, and also Moderna's. DHL also building freezer farms, and actually they're building them in Europe and also in the US. You have the government being involved, you have the NGOs being involved. For example, Red Cross is collecting convalescent plasma to start. Mm-hmm. So, But again, you need some sort of more centralized control and coordination, and that we're not seeing. And that's why I'm doing all these radio interviews and starting to lose my voice, and podcasts, because you need more of that. You need more of that transparency. Just having white papers released, Health and Human Services or DOD, that's not enough. You really don't have the fine details. What is really the network going to look like, the supply chain network? So you have the time element, you have the perishability element, you have the huge scale, and also the COVID pandemic is so different from the other kinds of disasters that have been happening, because it's not limited in geography, it's not limited in time. It's not like Katrina hits, it's horrible, but geographically it's limited, and time-wise it's limited. So extremely challenging period now in our history for everyone. But our skills and tools I don't think they've ever been more needed. So, I mean, that's good.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? It'd be better if we could meet in person and, we wouldn't be so in demand. But it's important now to respond. And the problems are absolutely fascinating too.
Yeah.
Lots of research. Students, you will be kept busy. Believe me. And faculty and practitioners.
For sure. So we are reaching the end of time. We still have many questions. I don't know if you have time for one more.
Okay, one more.
One more, let's do it. Last one. One more from Bistra, the final one. Are these models and solution methods available open source so others can apply them to their data or other problem domains where the same model applies? Like, for example, we have for MILP solvers and MILP models of common network design problems?
Okay, I think just about all of our papers are available online. Okay, the data we always publish, we don't hide anything. So, even with over 200 papers, people are reproducing our results all around the world. We really believe in that, and we report our output, we report our results and our input. We don't do the black box. And the algorithms in just about every one of our papers, very explicitly stated, very easy to implement. So, but no, we don't have it open source. I could use, hundreds of students. Now it's kind of challenging, right? In this administration with students and so on.
All right, wonderful. Well, what a vibrant Q&A session.
Yeah, thank everyone for staying. Sorry about the tech issues at the beginning.
Sorry about
There's
that.
always something.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time to...
You're welcome. Thank you for organizing. Thank you, Ty. And goodbye, everyone, even from India.